Good evening, everybody. I'm sure you enjoyed the flashes of expertise during the brilliant discourse of Dr. Dalal on diagnosis of pulmonary embolism. I'll be talking on the management of pulmonary embolism. The last couple of years has witnessed spectacular advances in the field of pulmonary embolism, both in terms of enhanced understanding and in the availability of a panoply of therapeutic options. The clot is usually detached from the cystic vein, usually from the leg, traverses the right side of the heart, as you can see on this, and lodges in pulmonary artery or one of its branches to produce pulmonary embolism and infarction. Now, this is the conventional VTE. I will also be briefly touching the COVID-19 VTE, which is creating headlines almost every day. And in the end, I'll briefly talk about prevention of pulmonary embolism. Dr. Dalal has already talked about this. Now, the therapeutic options for pulmonary embolism basically resolves around the use of lytic agent for lysis of the clot, prevention of clot formation by use of anticoagulants, mechanical treatment of clot either by percutaneous catheter or surgical embolectomy, IVC filters used rarely in very selected cases, as we'll see, and ECMO is utilized in refractory circulatory collapse as an adjunct to the treatment. As already told by Dr. Dalal, it is desirable to have a multidisciplinary pulmonary embolism team, at least for the high-risk patients. Now, whenever we treat pulmonary embolism, as already delivered by Dr. Dalal, the first thing is we try to discriminate whether it is a high-risk pulmonary embolism, an intermediate risk, or a low risk. And this can be easily differentiated by hemodynamic instability, the PASI score, the RV dysfunction, and the elevated cardiac troponin levels. So if you have a high pulmonary embolism, high risk pulmonary embolism, it should have hemodynamic instability, the PASI score should be high, RV dysfunction, and elevated troponin levels. Whereas in the intermediate high group, there is no hemodynamic instability, the PASI score is high, there is RV dysfunction and elevated cardiac markers. And the intermediate low, there is no hemodynamic stability, the PASI score is high, but one of the two is present, either you have RV dysfunction or elevated cardiac troponin. And in low scores, no hemodynamic stability, PASI scores is not high, RV dysfunction is not present, and the assessment is optional. Now, whenever we have a patient of high-risk acute pulmonary embolism, besides the symptomatic strategies, that is trying to maintain volume optimization, vasopressors, and inotropes, we quickly initiate with unfractionated heparin, and lytic therapy is the cornerstone of massive pulmonary embolism or high-risk pulmonary embolism, and RTPA is the agent of choice. 100 milligrams in 2 hours with an initial bolus of 10 milligrams. You can also use streptokinase, you can use also urokinase, but RTPA is preferred over streptokinase and urokinase. When we lyse these patients, it produces lysis of the clot, the obstruction is decreased, there's improvement in the pulmonary artery pressure, pulmonary vascular resistance, and reduction in the RV dilatation. The greatest benefit is seen when initiated within 48 hours of symptom onset, and this can still be useful even within 6 to 4 days of symptoms onset. Unsuccessful in about 8%, and bleeding may occur in 9%, and ICH at 1.7. When you're using lytic therapy, you must look at all these contraindications before initiating lytic therapy. Tenecteplase has also been used, retiplase has also been used, but these agents are not yet approved. Now, besides unfractionated heparin, we also use low molecular weight heparin, and we have data on NFWH, particularly enoxaparin. And as you can see, there is less all-cause 30-day death in enoxaparin-treated patients. The blue one is enoxaparin, the other one is UFH. And there's less major and minor hemorrhages in enoxaparin-treated patients. Enoxaparin has also been used with altiplase, and you can see there's no unacceptable increase of treatment-related complications, hemorrhage, recurrence, or death with use of SC-LMWH plus thrombolytic therapy. Now, if the thrombolytic therapy is not producing good results, we have to resort to other modalities of treatment like percutaneous catheter-directed treatment in the form of mechanical fragmentation of thrombus, aspiration of thrombus, or more commonly a pharmacological approach combining mechanical or ultrasound fragmentation of the thrombus. We can also resort to surgical embolectomy, and ECMO can also be used in patients with refractory circulatory or cardiac arrest. For the intermediate or low risk pulmonary embolism, anticoagulants are the mainstay of treatment. The anticoagulant usually is initiated without any delay. Usually a parental anticoagulant is initiated, LMWH or fondaparinux. When oral anticoagulants are used, you should give preference to a DOAC rather than VKs. But if VKs are used due to reason, the INR must be maintained between 2 to 3, and NOACs are not recommended in patients with severe renal impairment, pregnancy, lactation, and in patients with antiphospholipid antibody syndrome. Now, this shows the dose of various agents. UFH 80 units per kilogram bolus followed by 18 units per kilogram per hour. Enoxaparin either 1 milligram per kilogram every 12 hourly or 1.5 milligrams per kilogram. And if you are using fondaparinux, 5 milligram or 7.5 or 10 milligram, depending on the body weight, is less than 50, 50 to 100, or more than 100 kg. Low molecular weight heparins are good efficacy and safety. There's no monitoring requirement. Reliability is good and easy dose adjustment. Many times we have patients who have associated CKD, and then you must remember that you can use safely unfractionated heparin, but LMWH should be avoided, or if you are using, you have to adjust the dose according to the creatine clearance or eGFR. Fondaparinux should also be avoided in patients with moderate to severe renal functions, and DOACs are not recommended in patients with severe renal disease, eGFR 15 to 30, and VKs don't require any dosage adjustment in CKD. Now, this is an overview of the trials of the DOACs. They are non-inferior to LMWH. Rivaroxaban and Pexican can be used directly without LMWH. And the right-hand side of the slide shows that bleeding is minimum with apexaban. And this shows an overview of the extension studies. You can see apexaban, rivaroxaban, dabigatran, all are superior to placebo, and bleeding is least with apexaban, as you can see on the extension studies on the right side. These are the dosage schedule. Apexaban 10 milligram twice daily for 7 days, and then 5 milligram twice daily. Rivaroxaban 15 milligram twice daily for 21 days, and then 20 milligram once daily. And if you are using dabigatran, 150 milligram twice daily after 5 to 10 days in course of LMWH. It cannot be used directly. Now, if due to some reasons we are not able to get the desired response with anticoagulants, rescue thrombolytic therapy can be employed, or you can also resort to surgical embolectomy or even percutaneous catheter treatment. IVC filters are used only rarely, particularly if you have an absolute contraindication to anticoagulation, or there are recurrences despite therapeutic anticoagulation. Routine use is not recommended. Now, what should be the duration for VTE treatment? Now, 3 months anticoagulation is given for all patients. Now, after 3 months, if you find that patient with the first pulmonary embolism of VTE is secondary to a major transient or reversible risk factor, you can discontinue therapeutic oral anticoagulants after 3 months. But on the other hand, if you have situations like you don't have an identifiable risk factor, you have persistent risk factor, minor transient or reversible risk factor, you have to extend the therapy behind 3 months and reassess. And you may have to give it for lifelong in patients with recurrent venous thromboembolism, antiphospholipid syndrome, and similar such situations. Now, if an extended anticoagulant is advised, we usually prefer a DOAC, apixaban 2.5 milligram twice daily, or rivaroxaban 10 milligram once daily should be considered. And whenever you are using as an extended anticoagulation regime, you must periodically assess the liver function, the renal function, and also the bleeding risk, which is a dynamic process, keeps on changing. In patients who refuse to tolerate any form of oral anticoagulant, you can also use soladoxide 250 milligram, 1 or 2 capsules twice a day. Now, this is another interesting score, the Wiener prediction model, which is being utilized to see whether the anticoagulation therapy should be prolonged. And this is a dynamic score with some parameters, at least male, female, proximal DVT, distal DVT, pulmonary embolism, D-dimer levels, all are given points. And if the score is 180 or less, there's low risk of pulmonary embolism. If the score is more, anticoagulation can be continued for longer period of time. In patients with cancer, usually we give anticoagulation for 6 months, and if the cancer is not controlled, it may be indefinite. So you can review. Those patients who have gastrointestinal cancer, oral agent should not be given. Pregnancy with pulmonary embolism, again, the treatment of choice is low molecular weight heparin. And what is very important that if you are using a low molecular weight heparin, please be cautious that you do not insert a spinal epidural needed unless 24 hours have passed since the last therapeutic dose. And it is not recommended to administer Alumdebrev within 4 hours of removal of an epidural catheter. NOACs obviously are not recommended in pregnancy, and you can suspect amniotic fluid embolism. We don't have enough experience. If patient has unexplained cardiac arrest, sustained hypotension, and a DIC. Now, a few words about the venous thromboembolism in COVID, which is hitting the headlines every day. Now, all of us should remember that the COVID virus not only has an inflammatory potential, it has also a very thrombogenic potential. It produces endothelitis of the vessels. There is stasis of blood, there's hypercoagulability, and these small fibrous thrombi not only seen in the affected area, but also in the normal areas. And there is rise in a panoply of biomarkers. The D-dimer gets elevated, and many other markers, as you see on the screen, they get elevated. And if you look at the pulmonary embolism, COVID-19 in this study, 21% non-COVID pulmonary embolism or H1N1, the incidence of pulmonary embolism is much less. This is another study which shows that you have an ARDS in COVID-19, pulmonary embolism is 11%, whereas only 2% in non-COVID ARDS. And this shows that the cumulative incidence of VTE is 59% at 21 days compared to only 9% with ARDS COVID, non-COVID. And if you use heparins, it decreases mortality and also improves survival. So most of the guidelines at the present state of time, although they are still in the process of evolution, recommend heparin or low molecular heparin in patients who are admitted to ICU, and treatment if they happen to have developed VTE. Now, a word about prevention of pulmonary embolism. Now, this is the story of a senior physician who sought consultation for preoperative fitness for bilateral knee joint replacement. His friend physician gave him a clearance. He did not have any clinical or objective evidence of any abnormality, but 5 days after surgery, he developed hypotension and tachycardia and was sent to us as a suspected acute myocardial infarction. This is his electrocardiogram. You can see sinus tachycardia, you can see S1Q3 pattern, RV is hugely dilated, pulmonary hypertension, tricuspid regurgitation, and when we did the D-dimer, it was more than 10,000. He was treated with pulmonary embolism. He improved and is still alive. CT angiography, pulmonary angiography was also done and confirmed the diagnosis. Now, this should be publicized to all orthopedic surgeons that they have to give prophylaxis for VTE whenever they are giving a knee replacement or a hip replacement. And we now have oral DOACs. The Dosing schedule is very simple, as you can see on the slide, and this must be widely publicized to prevent the deadly complication. You want to use dabigatran, 110 milligram on the first day, then 20 milligram, rivaroxaban 10 milligram, apixaban 2.5 milligram. They are usually started after hemostasis has been achieved, hip replacement for 5 weeks and knee replacement for 2 weeks. Now, VT is also associated with acute medical illness. Here, enoxaparin decreases the incidence of VT with some increase in bleeding. And when we look at the trials of DOACs, they have shown dismal results. All DOACs trials have failed to produce positive results. So low molecular weight heparin, enoxaparin is used for preventing VTE in acute medical illness. Now, whether the anticoagulant should be continued after hospitalization, all guidelines agree that during hospitalization they should be administered, but after discharge there's some variation. The chest guidelines do not recommend after hospitalization, but guidelines like NAS, they say if there is an increased risk for VTE, this should be continued at least for a minimum of 7 days, and you can further review, and that seems to be the right approach. If the patient has improved after pulmonary embolism with treatment, we follow up these patients, looking at the adequacy of anticoagulation, looking repeatedly at the bleeding risk. We assess for recurrence of pulmonary embolism, and if patient is developing a chronic thromboembolic pulmonary artery hypertension, we refer to a specialized clinic which is more experienced in the management of this problem. So in summary, pulmonary embolism is a potentially lethal disease, and if diagnosis is missed or untreated, it has a very high mortality. Treatment strategies basically revolve around lytic therapy and anticoagulants, and in serious unresponsive cases, percutaneous catheter treatment of surgical embolectomy has to be resorted. ECMO may also be used. Attention should always be focused on prevention of VTE. The duration of anticoagulant therapy can be determined by panoply of factors, and in patients on extended therapy, DOACs are preferred. The bleeding risk is a dynamic process, and we must continue to assess repeatedly. Thank you very much for your kind attention.
Thank you very much, Dr. Manoria, for a very wonderful presentation, as well as those clinical pearls related to treatment as well as prevention. Thanks once again for touching even on the preventive aspect, which we usually don't cover in the management part, but you rightly mentioned a clear message to other specialties also, from where we get these cases often, especially orthopedic surgeries. So we have got some good queries in the Q&A box, sir. So I will just put those questions across to you. So first question, what is the mechanism of syncope in pulmonary embolism? Maybe Dr. Jamshed can take this.
I suppose when you get a severe pulmonary embolism, you get occlusion of the main pulmonary artery. So it's a reduced outflow from the right ventricular, and therefore reduced input into the left side, and hypotension. So it's basically clearly a hemodynamic obstruction of the main pulmonary artery that is starts of the whole trigger process for the syncope.
Okay, sir. Thank you, sir. So next question is, how is pulmonary embolism and pulmonary hypertension prevalence connected? Any relation between these two? Dr. Manoria, your thoughts, please.
See, pulmonary embolism, if it is inadequately treated, the risk factors are not treated, there's suboptimal anticoagulation, you can get recurrence and ultimately end up with thromboembolic pulmonary artery hypertension.
If I may add a point,
we follow up these patients. Yes, Dr.
Yeah, if I may add a point out there, there are certain groups of patients in whom you can thrombolize them and you may not thrombolize them. Those with the intermediate low risk. Now here there's a lot of sort of debate going on as to whether if we treat these lower risk patients, you're not treating them for reduction of immediate mortality, which is not high in the intermediate low risk group. But some suggest that by treating them with thrombolysis, you may reduce the long-term pulmonary hypertension and the chronic pulmonary embolism, chronic issues. Now that's a debatable thing. I don't know whether we have an answer to that, Dr. Manoria, whether these patients should be thrombolized or not, because we are not doing it for acute mortality, but whether in the future they will have less pulmonary embolism. So I think, again, like we do in coronary artery disease, we'll have to risk stratify bleeding versus high bleeding risk versus no. If you have a patient who's obviously a high bleeding risk patient, then I would not take the risk of thrombolizing the patient for long-term pH benefit. But if the patient has got low bleeding risk, young patient, you might consider thrombolysis so that he doesn't, after a few years, develop pulmonary embolism, pulmonary hypertension. So that's a bit of a debatable thing for which there
I
is no
think
answer.
you are right. If we treat intermediate patients also, perhaps our probability of developing chronic thromboembolic pulmonary artery hypertension may be decreased because we are lysing the clot.
Sir, I mean, this concern, are you talking about intermediate high or intermediate low or both intermediates?
Usually intermediate low. With
Okay.
intermediate high, there will be much more tendency towards thrombolizing the patient, but with intermediate low, where really there's no mortality benefit by thrombolizing the patient, but there is a possibility that some of these people may remain and develop chronic pH in the future. It's like basically DVT. If you treat DVT less aggressively, you might land up with a DVT foot and swelling and other future problems. And if you treat it more aggressively, you take the risk of bleeding, but you reduce the future DVT consequences of the leg.
Okay, sir. So another question by Dr. Chandrasekhar. He is asking thrombolysis in CKD and pregnancy with pulmonary embolism. Any considerations when we are doing this? Dr. Manoria, you can take this.
In pregnancy, lysis can be done if the patient is a high-risk pulmonary embolism. You have to look at all the contraindications and the bleeding risk before you initiate lytic therapy. So it can still be done if the patient is belonging to a high risk, but taking into consideration the patient does not have any bleeding risk or contraindications for lytic therapy.
So
I suppose I think you have to look at the individual patient. If the patient, say the lady is pregnant and the patient is going to die of pulmonary embolism, you really can't think of the baby in terms of doing thrombolysis or not, because there the importance is the saving the mother's life. You may produce intrauterine bleeding, etc. You might lose the baby, but here the importance should be saving the mother's life as the primary thing. So if the patient's in a shock condition and likely to die, I mean, the kid's going to die as well. So you should thrombolize these patients to save the mother's life. So in this situation, the mother's life takes predominance over the baby's life.
sir, thrombolysis in CKD, sir. Any considerations for this?
CKD patients are always at a high risk of bleeding, so you have to be careful. But once a patient is having a life-threatening disease, you have to take chances.
Okay, sir. Sir, past history of stroke. Any considerations if you are treating such kind of patients for PE thrombolysis?
If you have a hemorrhagic stroke, this is a contraindication. If you have a ischemic stroke, at least 3 months should elapse before you initiate it.
So hemorrhagic, even if it is more than 3 months, we should.
Hemorrhagic, there may be issues, but if it is less than 3 months, you should never thrombolize.
Okay. Okay.
I think one of the ways in which the Western countries have sort of overcome this situation is that how do you thrombolize a patient without producing bleeding? Now, there are various ways in which it can be done. There's a couple of papers on half-dose use of thrombolytic therapy, TPA, and they've used half-dose TPA in these patients in the hope that you would have some benefit on the pulmonary embolism with lesser bleeding. So that is one thing you can consider when the patient's a high bleeding risk patient. At the same time, the risk of pulmonary embolism is high. You can give half dose of TPA. So you're sort of balancing the two. And the second is what is called as an ultracath intrapulmonary thrombolysis. Now, what they do in ultracath thrombolysis is that they put a catheter in the pulmonary artery, which has got an ultrasound probe on it. And that ultrasound beams breaks the pulmonary emboli. And then you give a small dose of TPA. And the dose of TPA in that intracath thrombolysis may be as low as 8 or 16 milligrams of TPA. So instead of giving 100 milligrams, you're giving a very 1/5 the dose. The advantage is that obviously the lesser the dose of thrombolysis, lesser will be the bleeding problems. But at the same time, the thrombus will be dissolved and that acute shock part will be reduced. So maybe you may not resolve all the pulmonary embolism, but the combination of ultracath. Now, we don't have ultracath, I think, available with us. I have never used it. So, of course, in these desperate situations, we've all done this in the past. I'm sure Dr. Manoria has done. We put pigtails in the pulmonary artery and then we move the pigtail around in the hope that the clot dissolves. And we give a little bit of thrombolysis in the pulmonary artery in the hope that some dissolve. Because what you want to do in a massive pulmonary embolism, if it's blocked the whole right pulmonary artery, if you want some flow to be established, then that may serve the purpose. It's basically the same thing as thrombolysis in a coronary infarct. Your LAD is completely occluded. you give thrombolysis, even though the lesion remains 90%, you establish some flow. That some flow is enough to keep the myocardial preserved. So that some flow in the pulmonary arteries may also help the patient to survive the acute shock situation. So these are the two options: half-dose TPA and ultracath or otherwise local thrombolytic therapy, where you can cut down the dose of the TPA and thereby reduce the bleeding consequences.
Okay, sir. So Dr. Joey is asking, can you be more clear on heparin and enoxaparin regimen when you are using lysis with streptokinase or RTPA, both pre and post lysis? So how do we timing and dosage of heparin as well as enoxaparin in relation to these TPAs or streptokinase?
If you are using streptokinase, if you are using TPA, you can use unfractionated heparin. Low molecular weight heparin is also being used along with TPA. I showed you the data. If you are using streptokinase, you can also use along with it.
I think you can usually think about it in the same way as you think of a myocardial infarction. What do you do with a myocardial infarction? You don't use TPA. So mind you, in USA, they still use TPA for myocardial infarction. And I found that out because when they started using thrombolysis in the COVID patients and not doing primary PCA, most of the centers in USA were using TPA and not the tenecteplase, which is not very commonly used in USA. So when you use TPA in infarction or use streptokinase, we usually give low molecular weight heparin. And we usually give it at the time of thrombolysis, because otherwise if you don't give it, then they get reocclusion. So it can, as Dr. Manoria said, you can give either regular heparin or low molecular weight heparin. And again, I'm not sure about the dose of TPA in elderly patients, because we know from the STREAM trial that if you give tenecteplase, you have to reduce the dose down. So I think maybe in the very elderly, 75 plus, 80 plus, etc., that you might need to reduce your dose of TPA and adjust that according to the age. The important thing to remember, unlike a myocardial infarction, the patient with a pulmonary embolism is a different phenotype, in a sense that a patient with an infarction will usually be in the 60s, 70s. He'll be usually a more healthy person, and he will have less comorbidities. In a patient who's a pulmonary embolism, especially in the Western people, Western countries, they're usually very old people, 80, 85, multiple comorbidities, having had procedures, not been mobilized. So you're dealing with a different set of population. And this is why the bleeding is usually more in when you're treating PE patients rather than when you're treating infarct patients, because the basic quality of the patient is much poorer in the PE group rather than in the infarct group. So you must remember these two differences. So in a PE group, be a little bit careful. They're older, more likely to bleed, multiple comorbidities. You might want to reduce the dose of both your heparin and your low molecular weight and your thrombolysis. Of course, everything depends on the acuteness of the problem. If the patient's dying in front of you, of course, you can't keep worrying about bleeding.
Sir, one more question by Dr. Sunil Jatani. He is asking, if heparin works, then why do we use NOACs for hip and knee replacement for prevention of VTE? So any data which suggests this?
The oral schedule is very convenient. That's why the usual practice these days is to use DOACs for prevention of VTE after hip replacement or knee replacement. You can still use low molecular weight heparin, but that is less convenient. Oral agents are always convenient and preferred, and they don't require monitoring. Low molecular weight heparin also does not require monitoring.
Yes. So one more question by Dr. MC Agarwal. He is asking how much time lytic therapy should be done. So is there any such, I mean, maybe he's asking any such window period kind of thing here in this PE.
Lytic therapy should be done at the earliest for good results. If you delay, you will still get the results. It's not like myocardial infarction, you have a cutoff window of 12 hours or so. In pulmonary embolism, it is an ongoing process. Thrombus continues to form, it gets lyse, so even you can use even up to 6 to 14 days, but it should be used at the earliest to get the optimum results. It's not, the window is just not acute like myocardial infarction, you have a cutoff point. This is an ongoing process.
It got stuck, I think. Okay. Sir, one more question. Dr. Daria Singh is asking, do you think COVID-19 involves small blood vessels and capillaries rather than big vessels causing PE?
COVID-19 produces endochilitis. It involves the arterioles and the capillaries, and immunomodulation is also believed to be one of the process as shown by histological examination of the pulmonary arterioles. It also involves the large veins. You can get DVT. You can also get thrombosis in the arteries. You can get coronary thrombosis, acute myocardial infarction, CVA due to cerebral thrombosis also been seen. It's a highly thrombogenic virus. So you can get all sides of thrombogenic complications. Arteries, veins, arterioles, capillaries, highly thrombogenic.
Okay, sir. So you're saying microthrombi will also be there
Yes.
apart from embolism.
This is one of the reasons for multi-organ failure. Why multi-organ failure occurs? Because small vessels of different organs, liver, kidney, they get involved, and you have a multi-organ failure in later stages of the disease. That is the genesis of multi-organ failure.
Okay. Sir, one question. I have a patient, male, 49 years, developed pulmonary embolism despite adequate anticoagulation. What can be done? I have switched to enoxaparin, and what INR should we set for? Any role of IVC filter?
Enoxaparin does not require INR. If you have a pulmonary embolism which is not responding to anticoagulation, provided you have repeatedly checked that the anticoagulation is optimal, it should not be that you are using VKs, your anticoagulation is not optimal, and you should make sure that whatever drugs you are giving, it is producing optimum. If despite that, then you can use IVC filter. One of the indications for IVC filter is failure of optimum anticoagulation to produce the benefit, or the anticoagulants are contraindicated due to one reason. Usually it is not routinely used.
I would like to mention one point
Please.
about IVC filter. At least in my practice, I see that who puts IVC filter depend on who's treating the patient, which is why I think it's very important to have a protocol to decide who treats the patient. I've found now that just about everybody wants to treat the patient, and if the patient is referred to, for example, an intervention radiologist, then often the intervention radiologist just goes ahead and puts a filter. I must remember that when you put a filter, you require anticoagulation. So if you're putting a filter because the patient cannot be anticoagulation, you must remember that if you put a filter, you will need long-term anticoagulation. So you put a filter, you must put a filter which is retrievable and not a filter which gets stuck. And then we also know that when you put a retrievable filter, large number of patients, the filter is then not retrieved. So they require to continue on anticoagulation. So please don't feel that the filter solves all the problem. But as Dr. Manoria mentioned, if you cannot anticoagulate a patient at all, and you have no option, number one. Number two, if the patient has an emboli, in spite of being on anticoagulation, there's a huge amount of proximal DVT which is present. Or if the patient's in a very shock condition with a lot of DVT and a possibility that the next embolism will kill the patient, those are some of the reasons for putting an IVC filter. Sometimes I've seen that the radiologist or the vascular surgeon, nowadays even vascular surgeons are treating pulmonary embolism because they often come with DVT. They try and do manipulation of the leg for reducing the embolus load in the legs. And now when they're doing manipulation in the leg, they have to prevent that clot from going up, so they have to put an IVC filter. So I think the IVC filter has been put in a lot of reasons, but we need to be very careful. We should not just put it in anybody and everybody. There should be very specific indications for using the IVC filter.
Sir, one more question is coming up. This is failed thrombolysis. When do we decide that this is a failed thrombolysis, and what do we do further?
Failed thrombolysis, we will not have any improvement in the parameters on echocardiography. You will not have reduction of the pulmonary artery pressure or pulmonary vascular resistance. Tricuspid regurgitation will not decrease. Patient clinical condition, blood pressure will not improve. Pulse rate will not decrease. These are the criteria which are being utilized to see thrombolysis has failed.
Okay, sir. Sir, one last.
Then you have to look at some mechanical intervention, either surgical embolectomy or some sort of mechanical, because if thrombolysis has failed, patient still remains in shock, then you have very little option. Then you have to go somewhat mechanical and take a chance with that. And we have seen a couple of patients having a surgical embolectomy also done, especially in those with a massive pulmonary embolism right at the saddle, blocking everything. If you manage to get over the surgery, you just remove that and they do very well. But of course, it's a high-risk situation and both sides are high risk, not doing and doing. But it's one of the options when a patient, anyway, you have nothing else. You thrombolized him, he still remains in shock, and you have no option other than to remove the clot some way or the other.
Sir, another question, any data about D-dimer values in COVID-19 patients? And how do we
D
interpret those?
dimers are elevated in large number rather. All those who are hospitalized in it will be elevated, and some of them have very serious elevations. That's why we recommend anticoagulation for those patients, even on a prophylactic basis, if they are admitted in ICU. Any patient admitted in ICU, vast majority will have elevation of D dimers and other parameters.
Sir,
Just as
Dr.
a separate point, since we are on the D-dimer, sometimes when you have to decide whether the patient, we should continue anticoagulation in the follow-up period, as Dr. Manoria mentioned, you can use the help of D-dimer. If you are, say, finished 6 months of therapy, you are not sure whether you should continue or not, some clinical symptoms are doubtful, and if the D-dimer is still high, then I think it is better to continue. So D-dimer can be used sometimes in these conditions where you cannot be sure whether to continue or not, as a factor in which you can decide whether to continue or not. So if D-dimer is completely normal, you can be more likely to stop the long-term anticoagulation. And if the D-dimer is still very high, you may want to continue it for the next 3 months or 6 months.
Okay, sir. So Dr. Jaikumar is asking, is it justified to stop DVT prophylaxis in unprovoked pulmonary embolism, as there is a chance of recurrence?
See, unprovoked embolism, pulmonary embolism, unprovoked DVT, it should be continued for a very long period. You have to periodically assess either by the score which I have shown. We don't have very specific measure to decide what should be the length of long-term prophylaxis in such patients, such subgroup of patients. But I think that D-dimer score can be utilized to period, but it has to be continued for a long time. It's unprovoked DVT, because if we get a pulmonary embolism, it can create lots of problems and may be fatal.
Especially if he's got some protein S, protein C, and other deficiencies. Dr. Manoria has also mentioned that then you require long-term, and you must also require, and this also Dr. Manoria has mentioned, that you cannot use NOACs in these patients. In these patients with other deficiencies, you have to use warfarin. So please remember that this is 2 reasons when you have to do long-term and where you cannot use NOACs.
Sir, we are almost done with most of the questions. We still have few, but in the interest of the time, we will call it a day for the time being. Hope it is okay with you both, sir.
Yeah, you can finish 1 or 2 questions if you want. If Dr. Manoria has no problems, I think we can take another 2 minutes if somebody wants to, some question which is different from what Lynn already asked.
Sure, sir, sure. So Dr. Sunil Jatani is asking.
Manoria?
Yeah, no problem.
Dr. Sunil Jatani is asking, after thrombolysis, patient is symptomatically better, but echo is still showing RA-RV dilatation. Should we treat further or just put him on DOAC?
Now, after thrombolysis, you have to continue long-term anticoagulation therapy. Near thrombolysis, the treatment of high-risk pulmonary embolism or intermediate high-risk does not stop. Anticoagulation has to be continued for a long time, and depending on the subset of patient, you have to decide the length of the treatment. What has produced DVT, so they have to be continued for a long time.
One more question. I don't know. I mean, this is, thrombus in right atrium. Do we need to remove it surgically?
That is a very tricky situation.
Yeah.
The removal of clots in the heart is always a debatable problem. Whether it's a clot in the atrium or it's a clot in the left ventricle, we have debated this so often. For example, suppose you see a massive clot in the LV, which is seen many times. There are many people who say, no, it must be surgically removed, it will go this, that, but there is no debate, there is no answer to it, there is no randomized trial to it. Most people would say that removing surgically clots is a tedious process, difficult process, and might result in thromboembolic problems. So I think there's no clear-cut answer. I think, Dr. Manoria, there's no clear-cut answer on this. If you feel that there's a big thrombus and patient's chance of dying are there, surgeon's confident, you have no other surgical risk, you may think about it. But that's not really an answer to the clot in the heart. And again, one more point I would mention, there's a recent data, not a randomized trial, but a follow-up of patients with LV clots. Not RA clots are very rare, so you don't really have any data on those. But in LV clot, should we give NOACs or should we give vitamin K antagonist? That's been a debate for a long time. And many people have shifted to using NOACs for LV clots. There's a recent, I think about a month or 2 ago it came, it's not a randomized trial, it's just a follow-up of the patients, and they found that there was a much higher incidence of strokes and embolism if you use NOACs. So on the basis of that registry data, the suggestion is that if you have an LV clot, please use VKAs rather than NOACs. No randomized trial, but observational data suggesting that VKA treatment is better than NOACs in LV clots. That's an unanswered question, but there's some pointer towards using VKA rather than NOACs in LV clots. And therefore, by that presumption, if you see a patient with pulmonary embolism with a thrombus in the RA, I would suggest that that may be a correct patient not to give NOACs and to continue VKA or heparin if you want to, whichever way you want.
So one question is, patient is on DOAC and continued without monitoring, and there is a bleeding. I mean, lot of bleeding seen after that. What is your advice?
See, patients on DOAC usually do not require any monitoring, but there are certain subset of patients who are prone for bleeding. And one such important subset is CKD. Particularly, we are using dabigatran. If you have a CKD, and the status of CKD keeps on fluctuating. If you get an acute infection, you can have an increase in the creatinine levels. So that is one of the condition. And you should also look for the other bleeding risk scores, the Hasblad score, which is you should assess the bleeding risk repeatedly because it keeps on changing. But if you have a patient with CKD, it's better to have apexaban, which is the least bleeding risk, rather than dabigatran. Dabigatran should be avoided if patient has moderate or severe CKD. More safer is apexaban.
Yeah, mainly
and if
because
you have bleeding, you can even switch on to the warfarin or acetylene.
yeah, you must remember that dabigatran is predominantly excreted by the kidneys. So,
Kidneys.
in my opinion, if you've got a kidney problem, best to avoid dabigatran instead of trying to adjust doses. And apixaban, as Dr. Manoria said, is probably the safe one to use. Again, one thing you must remember is that sometimes these patients are on aspirin for various other reasons. And many doctors forget to stop the aspirin when you start NOACs, and that might be the cause of bleeding. So please remember that unless absolutely indicated, like a recent stent or something, stop the aspirin when you give these patients NOACs. Because a patient may have coronary artery disease, he's on aspirin because he had a stent put 5 years ago, and then he has a pulmonary embolism. You forget to stop the aspirin. So patient keeps taking the aspirin, then you give them NOACs, and then they start bleeding. So please make sure the patients are no antiplatelets unless absolutely indicated when you start a NOAC.
One last question. We will close with this: thrombocytopenia and anticoagulant therapy or prevention, prophylaxis, whatever it is. Any comments?
Thrombocytopenia may be encountered with heparin or low molecular weight heparin due to HIT, heparin-induced thrombocytopenia. The heparin should be stopped, and agatepan can be used to treat it. Direct thrombin inhibitors are used to treat it. You should not use LMWH also. It's a rare complication, but can be seen. You will have thrombocytopenia and thrombosis both together.
Okay, sir. So if it is not HIT and if it is a pre-existing thrombocytopenia, any cutoffs below which we shouldn't be giving this?
If it is above 50,000, there is no issue.
Okay.
But if it is less than that, 10,000 or 20, then there are below 10,000, there are chances of bleeding, as happens with dengue fever many times.
Yeah, 50,000, no problem. 30,000, be careful. Below 10,000, probably stop. I mean, simplistic. I mean, that's not the real answer, but that's sort of some sort of a guideline. There's no, you have to individualize these patients.
So thank you very much, sir. In fact, it's like a rapid fire session. Yeah, please, sir, please.
Before we end, I would like to make one request to everybody. Please start some sort of a pulmonary embolism protocol in your hospital. Because my feeling is that the pulmonary embolism is not well treated because too many people treat. When a pulmonary embolism comes to the casualty, this is what I've seen in my hospital because we don't have a PERT team, to be honest. We're trying to get that going. What happens is that the casualty officer, whoever it is, depending on the time of the day or night, will call any of these people. So it might be treated by a cardiologist, intensivist, physician, pulmonologist, vascular surgeon I've seen being called, and even a radiologist to do pulmonary catheter treatment for these patients. So 6, 7 people anybody might be called. And the treatment dramatically differs between who you call. Most cardiologists will follow the protocol that Dr. Manoria suggested, diagnosis, treatment, and follow the protocol. But sometimes there is suddenly everybody undergoes CT scan, somebody suddenly goes and puts an IVC filter. So I think we should have some protocol in hospital as to who should treat the patient. You can not exclude anybody, but you could take the help of different specialities. You should have a fixed protocol which must be followed for every patient, not that every patient should have a CT angio done. You should do the D-dimers, you should do the echo, you should stratify the patient and then decide treatment. Thrombolysis is a dangerous treatment, should not be given randomly to all the patients. At the same time, you should not miss pulmonary embolism. I think missing pulmonary embolism is a big problem, especially in the inpatients. When the inpatient patient complains of breathlessness, the chances are that sister will come, start oxygen, not do anything. The RMO will come, might do something, give some Lasix, and the pulmonary embolism is missed, which is why you need a pulmonary embolism team who goes and assesses the patient and make sure that this is not pulmonary embolism, and then fine, you do whatever you want. If it is pulmonary embolism, do. So please start and set up some sort of a protocol in your hospital, both for inpatient and for patients who come to the casualty. I think that will help diagnosis and help management of these patients. I'm sure Dr. Manoria will agree with me that it's a very hodgepodge treatment in many places.
Yeah, it should be done. Many times it is missed.
Yeah. We can end now.
Most of them are sent as acute myocardial infarction and shock.
Yeah, and that's why when you do postmortems, you find a large incidence of pulmonary embolism deaths, which are often thought as cardiac. So many times the cardiac deaths are actually pulmonary embolism deaths, and you don't pick them up. But if you do, as the autopsy studies, like I showed you in my first slide, I didn't go into details, but there's a very high incidence of pulmonary embolism in autopsy patients.
Thank you very much, sir. Thanks a lot for very wonderful deliberations both of you had, Dr. Manoria and Dr. Jamshed. We are very much lucky to have you here, both of you, same time for this wonderful session. And I thank all the audience also for their patient hearing. We had more than 100 participants at one point in time. And we hope that these learnings would definitely help in their clinical practice as well. Until the time we meet again with one more new topic, we wish you all the best. And please take care of your health and your safety. We wish for your safety as well. Thank you, sir.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Bye, Dr. Manoria. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Doctor.
Thank you, Anurag. Thank you, Bharat. Sachin, bye. Jitendra ji, bye.
Yeah, thank you. Bye.
Thank you very much, sir.
Thank you, Dr. Vijay. Thank you, Dr. Manoria.
Thank you. We enjoyed the session.
Yeah. Same here, sir.
Same here. ठीक है जी, अनुराग जी, हाँ, thank you. Sachin, thank you. Jitendra ji, thank you.
Yeah, thank you, sir. Have a nice.
Very nice.
Have a nice day. Have a nice night. Good night.
Good night.
Good night, sir. Good night.
Good night.
Okay. Chalo, Anu.